Good morning and thanks for joining today's webinar, the last in our GDPR compliance series. This time round looking at how compliant your mobile fleet is as regards to GDPR and considerations that companies need to be thinking about as regards to protecting data everywhere, supporting their roaming and mobile users. My name is Shona Bradshaw. I'm delighted to be joined today by Tom Davison, who's the SE Manager for EMEA for our partner Lookout. So we'll be taking you through the bulk of the presentation, looking at mobility and GDPR and how those two topics align. Just to give you a very quick agenda for today, I'll start off with a little bit of housekeeping before introducing who we are as Bytes. I will keep that brief, as many of you know it already. Give a brief overview of some of the key points on GDPR, just to recap on what the main issues are before introducing Tom at Lookout. Tom will be talking about how GDPR relates to mobile and mobile users, and then take companies through some guidance and solutions to help you define your approach to achieving that. Lastly, we'll do an interactive Q&A at the end, so we would encourage you to put any questions you have throughout Tom's presentation onto the chat box or questions box, and I'll pose them to Tom at the end of the call. So a little bit of housekeeping. Attendee lines are all on mute throughout the presentation, but we do encourage and welcome questions throughout. So as these occur to you, please do just post them via the chat to the questions box and we'll return to them all at the end. Set the webinar rules of engagement. We will be keeping discussions to strategy and solutions on the call, and we won't be getting into commercials and budgetary considerations on this session, of course, but you are more than welcome to have those conversations with your Bytes account manager after the webinar. We do have a recording available after the webinar so that you can review the content at your leisure and have a look at the slide deck as well, which will be shared, and share that within your wider businesses. And lastly, we have a feedback survey at the end of the webinar. Please do take 2 minutes to fill it in to just 6 simple questions so that we can continue to assure that sessions such as these are hitting the mark as regards topic and relevance. So who are Bytes? So we are a security specialist reseller within the Bytes Technology Group. We've been focusing on security for over 16 years, and that enables us to really specialise and focus on that area, providing resource and expertise and consultancy. We're part of the 2 billion Bytes Alton group, posted on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, so we're there able to marry up the specialist approach of the smallest independent reseller with the resources and security of working with a large group. And something we're very proud of at Bytes is our expertise in consultancy. We have a full suite of technical services around all of the solutions we work in-house, and we also have direct-to-engineer in-house support. So our customers speak direct to accredited engineers on support calls when they're dealing with vendor technologies. And due to that, we enjoy top-tier vendor partnerships, allowing us not only to deliver on the technical expertise of what you'd expect from each vendor, but also to deliver real commercial value with each solution that we provide. So where do we work across? We work across network security, as you'd expect, from firewalls, web security and content control. We have a real focus and specialisation on data security, data loss prevention and classification, authentication and access control, and lastly, as you'll see, we also specialise in mobile security, so not just mobile device management, but solutions to secure mobile devices, roaming users, and new technologies such as smartphones, smartwatches, etc. So within all of these areas, where do we add value? What do Bytes actually do? We offer technology delivery, installation and maintenance, in-house support. We are qualified accredited engineers. We run security education, strategy development and technology mapping sessions with customers, and we are involved with customers in scoping, planning and delivering, making sure that security solutions that are invested in maximise that investment and they get the value from those solutions. So that's enough about us. Why is GDPR a game changer? Why are we talking to businesses right now about GDPR? So it seems a long way away, May 25th, 2018. However, there is a journey that customers need to go to in order to comply. There are no silver bullets which will tick the box, done, and achieve compliance. The GDPR both exists the remit of the existing Data Protection Act and Data Protection Directive, and adds completely new obligations which make it more difficult for companies as it currently stands to prove compliance. So there are technologies and processes that companies will have to take time to put into place to prepare for May 2018. It's extraterritorial, so what does that mean? Companies, no matter where they're based, US, UK, South Africa, if they process and store EU citizen personal data, will have to comply with GDPR. Those will essentially trump their local legislation. Brexit, so as specifically for the UK, in or out, the rules will apply. Not only does GDPR come into force prior to Article 50 being completed, but also the UK government was highly involved and essentially wrote a vast majority of the GDPR regulation and clauses. So we will be adopting it in the UK, there is no doubt about that. The fines, up to 4% of global revenue in the event of a severe breach, and 2% in the event of global revenue. And I do need to mention that is group global revenue. So for a small company such as Bytes within a larger group, so that is actually really quite significant. If you look at the Yahoo breach, Yahoo would be writing a very large no-good check had GDPR been enforced with their breach last quarter. Lastly, and it's really important to say that the reason that we're talking to customers about this now is that it requires an interdepartmental review of how to comply. Your legal teams, your IT ops teams, IT security teams, all need to be working together to make sure that they are compliant and that you achieve that compliance, or at least improve to the ICO come 25th of May, that you're on that journey to compliance and you're working towards that. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Tom Davison, who is the EMEA SC Manager at Lookout. We've been working with Lookout for 2 years now, because they add real value in the mobile protection space. They extend the functionality of your traditional mobile device management partners to provide true mobile security and protection against mobile threats and data leakage from the mobile space. I've talked to you about the basics of the legislation, so I'm going to hand over to Tom now to talk about some of the practicalities of securing data everywhere on any device. Thank you very much. Over to Tom.
Thanks, Shona, and good morning, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen, so hopefully you can now see a slide deck.
Yes, you're both audible and visible clearly. Thanks, Tom.
Perfect, perfect. Well, thanks, Shona, for the introduction. So what I'm going to do for the next, I suppose, half an hour or so is just take you through a few more details on GDPR, talk a lot more about how it relates to mobile, and just put some ideas out there about how you can start to think about taking some steps, particularly in relation to mobile, to get your organization GDPR ready. I've just spotted the typo on my first slide there. Not a good start. So let's just begin. I mean, before we talk about GDPR, just have a quick look at the mobile landscape. So I've seen various different takes on this in the media recently, but there's definitely, we seem to be heading to consent that to agreement that mobile is taking over as the dominant platform, as in terms of time spent on device and time accessing data. The other interesting figure about that is also that this is increasingly moving towards apps rather than the browser, which is not unexpected if you think about mobile devices. The form factor means that apps, even if they're presenting a web front end to a user, are often much cleaner and more usable than a pure web interface. So we're seeing this steady migration from desktop to mobile. We're seeing this steady migration from browser to app. And then the other thing that's happening is, which is an interesting one, is really the idea of form factors converging and mobile ceasing to be this other thing. If anyone was listening to the headlines today talking about some of the potential exploits being distributed by some of the agencies out there to turn various devices in the home into surveillance-ware, like smart TVs and other things, we're seeing this convergence where everything's becoming empowered and enabled, and data can exist in lots of different places, and lots of different devices can be almost considered mobile. So we need to stop thinking about mobile as this other thing and this compartmentalized thing that isn't the mainstay of perhaps the IT team. It's a key part of any strategy when you look at securing data and becoming GDPR compliant. You have to consider mobile front and center with that. I mean, some of the challenges with mobile is obviously the trends we're seeing. So mobile is facilitated, and this is also facilitated mobile, this idea that much more data is out there in the cloud. And once, of course, it gets down to a mobile device, it's very easy for that data to pivot up into someone else's cloud, even if you didn't necessarily intend that to happen. So plenty of data out there. People use lots of different networks. So how many networks per day do you connect to on average? I'm sure you have a few networks that are your mainstays, but over the course of a month you'll encounter tens if not hundreds of different networks all outside of the control of the organization. And these are all a risk factor that we need to start getting a handle on. I've talked about phones and tablets, but wearables are another thing. Just a plethora of devices out there that are often running an Android style OS or some kind of branch of Android. And one of the challenges is not just the fact that these things have more and more power and accumulate more and more data. You get all sorts of branches of code that can be very difficult to patch. And I think the reason we heard the headlines this morning and it was perhaps so interesting is that there's a huge number of devices out there that are probably on branches of code with no updates available. So vulnerabilities that get exposed into mobile devices and perhaps wearable technology can persist for years, perhaps for the lifetime of that device. We've talked about apps. We'll talk a bit more about apps, but apps much more numerous. If you think about software, you used to download software from a number of key vendors that you had strategic relationships with. You would probably update that software a few times per year, and you knew an awful lot about the capability of that software operated within the confines of your environment. Of course, apps now, once they're on the App Store, once they've gone through the rudimentary approval process, they're there for anyone to use. And the quality, the emphasis I would suggest with apps is about speed. It's about being first. It's about getting updates out there. If you have that next big idea, you want to enable that and monetize that as quickly as possible. So I would argue perhaps less time and due diligence goes into security and data protection in an app as could be possible. So that's another thing to consider. And of course, that control of the app is often outside of the organization and it's the employee's hands. And this is the net effect. The control of data is firmly in the hands of your users. It's on the devices. It's being manipulated and viewed in apps of their choice. And geographically, it's traversing many different regions, countries, networks, which, when you sum it all up, is kind of a challenge, even without GDPR. But of course, GDPR is fast approaching, and we need to somehow reconcile this new world that has, I would say, crept up on us, but probably in reality has crept up on us over the last 10 years. But we've definitely passed the tipping point, but we now need to reconcile that new world with this new regulation that we have comparatively very little time to get our houses in order. We're talking about the middle of next year. So let's have a quick flick through GDPR before we look at further details on the mobile side. So some headlines. So Shona alluded to a few of these in her intro. We've got just probably about 15 months now, which is a scary little time for this to take effect. So GDPR will come into effect in all European states from 25th of May 2018. Coverage, we'll talk a bit more in the next slide, but this relates to global handling of EU personal data. So this isn't about personal data in an EU country. This is anyone that's handling, processing, controlling data for EU citizens or transacting business in EU countries, wherever they may be situated, that will be required to meet GDPR regulation. And of course, the definition of personal data is being broadened. There's more detail going into this. And this is one of the big confusing things in the first place I find when I talk to customers is what actually constitutes personal data and what are the bounds of the regulation. And of course, some of the complexity with all of these things, and including the following bullet around notification, is we've yet to see how this will pan out. So the final bullet here is notification of breaches. So the fines ranging from 2% or 10 million euros up to 4% or 20 million euros, whichever is greater, for failure to notify of significant breaches within a 72-hour period of the organisation becoming aware. So we don't really know exactly how this is going to play out, and there's a temptation, I suppose, to feel that you're perhaps under the radar and that there's safety in numbers and it's the outliers that will get hit. And I'm sure we will see some example cases coming along. There'll be some high-profile cases early on, I would expect, as we seek to kind of make an example and get this taken seriously. But equally, don't assume that you're immune from this just because you're perhaps not the biggest company in the world or the most headline of brands. So digging into the details of the themes a little bit more, there's a global reach to this thing. So if you think about this, it doesn't really matter where you're situated. It doesn't matter where the data is being processed. The key thing is if it's EU data relating to EU systems. Now, you need to think with mobile from the perspective of customer data, but also from the perspective of your employees, data you might be gathering and holding about your employees. And the regulation talks about controllers and processors. So you might outsource some of your data processing to a third party, but don't assume that removes liability from you, as part of that act. We've got more stringent measures around lawful processing and consent, so you need to be able to demonstrate why you're collecting the information that you're collecting, have established conditions for processing, and you need to have positive consent, so it's not enough just to have silent consent. Users need to know why you're collecting the data, perhaps as part of a contract for a service you're providing them, and they need to be able to give that consent and withdraw that consent at any time as well. So again, it becomes on the onus on you as an organization to understand what you're collecting, why, and make sure you're being very transparent about that process. We then also have a lot more in the way of accountability and governance. So it's the responsibility on the organization to demonstrate compliance with the regulation. And so that's going to mean probably a lot more in the way of recording activity, why you're doing it, how you're doing it. It's not going to be enough to claim ignorance. You're going to have to demonstrate at every step of the way that you're meeting compliance. And you may have to appoint a data protection officer or take on the services of a data protection officer to kind of oversee this and have that governance chain of command. Another change from because bearing in mind this is an evolution effectively of the Data Protection Act but becoming a regulation, one thing that was sort of there but has been really heavily boosted are the rights of the individual, so the rights of the data subject. And some of these have been the things you may have already seen in some of the high-level headlines, but some of the rights the individuals will now have will be rights to be informed on what data you have on them, how it's being used, rights to have access to that data if they want to see what you hold on them, rights to have it rectified if there are any mistakes in that data that you hold. The right to be forgotten or the right to erasure is one that's been talked about a lot. If someone contacts you and demands that you remove every piece of personal data that you hold on them, that could be a very expensive and challenging exercise. So of course the main thing to do there is not to hold any in the first place unless you really need it. We'll talk about that in a bit more further down the line. And then the last one is this idea of data portability. So an individual has the right to be able to come to you at any time and say, I'd like the data you hold on me in a commonly available format, such as a CSV file, so that I can take that to another provider or take that for my own personal use. So the rights of the individuals, I'm sure there'll be, again, test cases here where people try to exercise these rights, so best to be prepared in the first place. Privacy by design. So privacy shouldn't be an afterthought, it should be built in. Data protection should be built in from the beginning. And you'll hear this phrase talked about a lot, by design and by default. And this is something that we talk about in our product, and I'd urge you to sort of take that up with your suppliers. You know, are they adopting a privacy by default approach in the way that they provide solutions and services to you? And then the last one, this is probably the one that's had the most headlines, which we mentioned already, the idea of breach notification. And obviously to be able to notify, you have to be aware. And I think what's going to be interesting is how much it's an excuse to say you didn't have the ability to be aware, i.e. should you have had the tools or the measures in place to make yourself aware of common breaches that may occur. and I would argue you probably should. And then obviously you've got to have those tools up to date. You've got to have the right governance so people know how to react to that data and know what to do with it and where to take it. So those are some of the key themes. There's obviously loads of reading material out there, and there's lots of experts and lawyers that you probably should be consulting. But they're the high-level themes, and hopefully you've come across some of those already. But I think the interesting thing is, how does this apply to mobile? And for me, my personal view is there's a few different elements that are very relevant when you consider employee mobile devices or corporately owned mobile devices. So firstly is in data handling. It's an obvious one, but what data is actually on the device? So you might be putting in lots of controls around how you interact with your customers, how you collect and process data, but you then need to be sure about where that data is being stored and how it's being accessed. And that's very challenging with mobile. So things like who's accessing it, where from what device, how is it being stored, is it being transmitted anywhere else? All key questions you need to start being able to answer. And mobile is a real challenge in that regard. The other one that I think is a real difficult one for organizations is this idea of breach notification. So people have fairly good, I would say, perimeter security and tools in place within the organization to monitor those perimeters and look at any transgressions. But when it comes to visibility into mobile, people are normally very woefully inequipped. And so if a breach does occur, and the Target one was interesting, where we had this point of sale incident, slightly different to mobile, but interesting nonetheless, that if you don't have the tools, or even if you do have the tools but you're not using them in the right way, it's going to be very difficult for you to comply with the requirements around breach notification. And ideally, of course, you want to prevent any breach in the first place, because you want the protection there to stop anything potentially becoming a breach. And then the last one that I think is particularly relevant is this idea of privacy. So privacy is particularly challenging with mobile, because every time you try to put more visibility and potentially security into place in mobile, there's a balancing act with privacy. This was exactly the debate on the radio this morning regarding intelligence agencies' use of surveillance. How much privacy are we willing to trade for this idea of safeguarding? You'll find obviously with GDPR that there's hard and fast rules you need to abide by, so that's your start point. But with privacy, I guess I'm talking about privacy of your customers, but also privacy of your users here, as you maybe deploy tools to mobile devices. So just stepping back a bit, considering the data, most organizations tend to have data that they're aware on mobile devices, and then there tends to be this large grey area of data that they're either unaware is making its way to mobile devices. And then thirdly, there's this element of data that's available on a mobile device that hadn't perhaps been considered. So the camera is a very powerful tool on a mobile device, but it's also a very powerful data collection device that's often outside of your control. So if someone starts taking photos of whiteboards in meetings, useful tool, but can start to constitute data breach risk. And then there's other things on it. There's sensors that provide information that could start to become PII under the new regulation. So many things you want to consider when you look at mobile devices and what might be on there. I think the other more interesting point as well is this idea of apps on devices and how people are interacting with the data that you may have made available. So email is normally the first thing people think of, but you think of all the cloud data that may be out there, some of the SaaS apps that you might be starting to be to utilize. You possibly provide tools, but if you don't provide tools, you'll also find that employees are filling this gap themselves. They're going out there and sourcing mobile apps, and typically they're not going to want to pay for that, because if there's no budget internally, why would they pay out their own pockets? And there's a plethora of free apps out there to do all sorts of things that your employees need, and of course there's no real free, and what happens when you download free apps is the currency you're buying that app with is typically data. Now that may be personal data for that employee that's choosing to use the app, or it may be data that's somehow related to the company or constitutes some kind of PII under GDPR. And then there's the apps that even if they're ones you provide, or apps that I'd call legitimate apps that are on the App Store, there's all sorts of sensitive behaviors that can be embedded in those apps. So people typically start with this idea of a breach. They start with this idea of an attack on a device or against the data. And I think this is perhaps the explanation why mobile has been maybe lower in priority than some of the perimeter technologies people have put in recent years, because they're not seeing as many headlines, or traditionally they haven't seen as many headlines about risk of major breaches on mobile. But what they're not considering, of course, is the risk. And when you look at GDPR, it's all about accidental loss, breach, employee misuse. There's many elements to the way data is handled that you need to be thinking about. And I think the biggest risk by far at the moment is sensitive apps that introduce risk into the data handling and data processing chain of events. So, I mean, a good example is we've taken a lot of apps, analyze them, but you'll see apps have all kinds of capabilities to access data, to transfer data, and of course pivot that data up to other cloud services, data centers in other regions that you perhaps haven't considered. And so having this view on apps that are not necessarily malicious, but that can introduce some extra layer of risk is becoming a much higher priority for a lot of organizations out there, because this is really your start point for how you do the audit in the first place and understand the risks that you're opening yourselves up to. Another example of that, to take things even a stage further, is this idea of employees creating apps themselves. So that, and this can have two implications. It could be a really motivated employee that goes and builds their own app. More likely it's going to be some of the more convenient, cheaper, more available apps out there that perhaps make use of some of these tools or modular architectures to build themselves. So this is an example of a tool online which allows you to build an app, drag and drop. It's a bit like a WYSIWYG editor from website terminology. So you can drag various data sources into the app itself. You can collate all these data sources and correlate them together and get some useful information. So there's a number of different sources you can see here, and the challenge you have is as you start adopting these apps and services in the enterprise, it can be very challenging to limit employee access to those. And the app is the entry point. People can go and self-serve. And then an app, this is a good example here where this particular one, to improve performance, allows you to buy into their online database. And of course, guess what that does? It takes the data that you've downloaded from these other various data sources and it pushes it up into a unified database on this particular provider's site, which is completely outside of your control and ability to monitor. So lots of risks there. And we haven't even really talked about threats. Everything I've talked about up till now has been what I'd call legitimate app usage, but risky data handling and users still potentially being the weak link there. Of course, we've got threats on mobile devices, and there's a number of different vectors. I mentioned right at the beginning about networks people traverse. So man-in-the-middle attacks are real and demonstrable and not untrivial to carry out. So the idea of traffic being lost in transit is there. Now you might have a VPN, you might have mitigation within the app, but again, do you have visibility about which apps implement proper network security or proper storage at rest to know that you've got assurance around that? You've got increasingly threats that target the OS. So we see lots of threats that can be introduced by the user, like an end user jailbreaking or rooting the device, but increasingly threats at the sharper end are doing auto jailbreak and auto root of a device as part of their install. Lots of apps on Android that have rooting capability or can download additional modules to root the device once they've scoped the device and analyzed the vulnerable versions of OS that they're confronting. And equally with iOS, the big challenge you have with iOS is the fact that people can sideload apps onto devices, so they can tether devices for jailbreak. But sideloading allows you to load an app onto an iPhone without doing any kind of jailbreak. You just need the app to be signed by an Apple developer certificate. Any one of you can go and buy one of those certificates for $300, and you can create, sign, and distribute apps, or more to the point, what some of the less ethical people out there are doing is they're abusing that process to pirate content, and they're putting lots of content online for free apps that you should pay for through Apple App Store and provide those as side-loaded apps. So lots of ways threats can get onto devices. And of course, the other thing about apps themselves is they update frequently. So that whole process is typically out of your control as well. And new vulnerabilities can be introduced, new risks can be introduced every time the app updates, which typically will be tens of times a year for an average app these days. You know, gone are the days of software being updated every 6 months. You're now talking every couple of weeks on the whole. And when you look at visibility, this is what most people have. If I look at the threats I've showed on the previous screen and say, how aware are you of those things potentially happening in your environment, 90% of customers I see have this kind of view on things. Obviously, this is a better state of affairs, being able to have real-time visibility of what's happening on those devices, and even better, being able to deal with it so that data never actually leaks from the device and that breach never actually happens. And this is obviously where Lookout fit. This is one of the values that we add to mobile device security. And then a third factor is to consider is the idea that mobile devices are personal. So one of the big challenges that I see time and time again in organizations is that they've only got so far with the mobile strategy because they see issues around the personal aspect of mobile devices. So that could be the BYO device. More commonly, I would suggest it's a corporate-owned device that's been enabled for personal use. People really don't want to carry two devices, and they also don't really want to work for an employer that locks down their device so much that they can't keep in touch with their family, or they can't perhaps share photos and things easily. So like at Olympic, mobile devices are personal, and the other side of that is people expect a consumer-like experience. So even when they're using corporate apps and corporate services, they expect a consumer-like experience, and if they don't get that ease of use, that joy of experience, they'll, again, like I said earlier, go and try and source that for themselves. So this is a really tricky one to get a handle on. And there's a couple of things you need to consider. You need to consider serving the employees well so that they get the tools they need that you've been able to vet and approve, and try and avoid that need for them to step outside of the governance spotlight and source their own technology. But secondly, you need to avoid collecting any extra PII. And an example of what we do in our solution is this thing called pseudonymization, where you basically don't collect the data. You have an identifier that can map back to that data so that you can refer to it, you can link to it, but you don't need to hold a copy of that data. And we're increasingly seeing this as a requirement and a trend on solutions deployed on mobile devices. So lots of customers I speak to are looking to go back to a more native experience on a mobile device where they need to do less in the way of monitoring and locking down of the personal side, but they want that awareness. They want a real-time alert when there's a threat, and they want to be able to control that. But they want to do that in a way that doesn't collect any data that they don't need to have. So for example, if there's a threat on the device related to an app, do you need to know what that app is? Do you even need to know who the end user is? What you really need to know is that the threat was mitigated and never became an issue. So this is what I mean about privacy by design and privacy by default. The last thing you want to do at this stage of GDPR is introduce yet more technology, yet more challenges around data governance. You don't want to be collecting more and giving it to more people to access. You want to be limiting that as far as possible. So let's sum it up. We've talked about GDPR itself. We've talked about the trends in mobility. We've talked about some of the risks and challenges with the mobile environment. What do you do then to get your mobile environment GDPR ready? How do you keep on the right side of things moving forward? Well, I think this is the key principle. If you go to the ICO website, you'll see that there's 6 key principles that they call out with GDPR that are very broad, they're very generic, but they're trying as far as possible to be all-encompassing. So the idea is if you can read these 6 principles and nod your head and tick, you're in a strong place. And I would argue that when you look at mobile, Principle 6 is the one that stands out to me. It talks about personal data being processed in a manner that ensures appropriate security of the personal data. And the key one to me are accidental loss, destruction, damage, using appropriate technical or organizational measures. So mobile obviously has huge potential for accidental loss. The other things to think about here are technical and organizational measures. So mobile, unlike some other areas of the business, perhaps a far more requires technology and a human approach. There's a user in this that's one of the weakest links often and the driving force of how data gets handled. So a successful mobile strategy doesn't really start with technology. It starts with understanding the needs of your end users. It starts with being able to work with them to ensure that they understand what you're trying to do. They need to, when we talked about consent and lawful processing, if you're an organization deploying a solution to your employees, they need to know why it's there. They need to know what you can see about them, why you're collecting that information, all those things that are required, you need to consider here. You know, ultimately the end game for you as an organization is you want to be able to shield corporate data. You want to be able to, people to have access to it, but if a threat appears on the device, do this, restrict access while that threat's in place. That will relieve a lot of the risk of a breach occurring, and it means you've got visibility if something were to occur. But that's also joined up with this idea of at-risk. So the approach most companies adopt is they start here with manageability and containers. So they have mobile device management, they have perhaps the ability to control or contain data on that device, which is a really good first step. It's a bit like having encryption on a hard drive and authentication and management of a desktop to be able to patch up data and lock it down. However, the other things to consider are all the other vectors that can introduce threats that those technologies don't really cover. So this is where you'd start to layer other solutions that give coverage of app threats and at risk that could potentially undermine those. And again, the other trend I'm seeing is this drive towards native experience to move away as far as possible from restriction on the device, but have enough visibility and control around the data to be assured. So that might be, for example, provisioning policies around apps. So if you're using Microsoft, you'll probably be familiar of policies that you can wrap around Office 365 that mean you don't necessarily have to control the device, but you can revoke access to corporate data at will. And what's really powerful is if you can layer these things together and inform those solutions that can control by getting visibility across these other three areas, the other threat vectors on a mobile device. So mobile threat defense very much does that job, but the other part of the equation which companies consider and which you should have into your thinking around GDPR is this idea of mobile app reputation solution. And the market really at the moment has tended to lend itself to one or the other. Some of the solutions out there tend to be one thing or the other. But look at we're really covering both. So we have a single stop or one-stop view on all of this. So the idea is we can prevent threats on devices. We can inform any of those restriction solutions, management solutions like MDM or application wrapping solutions. But also you get visibility into risks that apps are introducing, either apps that employees are sourcing themselves or apps that you're perhaps whitelisting and provisioning directly through your MDM service. And so it's really, I'd urge you to kind of consider both sides of this coin. I think they're both relevant. You'll hear Gartner talking about both of these as capabilities that organizations need to embrace and need to have. I'm just going to end up, there's a case study here I'd point to on our, this is available on our website. This is a company in the Netherlands, a healthcare provider, who adopted our solution for exactly the reasons we're talking about today. They wanted to be compliant with local privacy laws and also start bolstering their position ahead of GDPR. So their particular concern was patient data that was on iPads that their employees were using. And they tried restricting, they tried locking down and found that productivity suffered and it didn't enable people to do their jobs well. So the idea was by loosening up a bit but putting governance in place and visibility in place, they could get what they needed done. So that's available on our website, and I urge you to have a look at that if it's of interest. And then the last thing I just want to put out there is this idea of visibility. So one of the things you'll have with GDPR is a concept of data impact, data processing impact assessments, where you look at what you're doing, you effectively some kind of audit. And I would suggest that's the start point with mobile. Before you take steps, look at the risk that might already be out there, which could be looking at potential for threats being in apps, it could be risk associated with those apps, it could be device and network risks. And we can, if you already have an MDM, something like AirWatch or Mobile Iron, we can take app inventory from that and we can run it through our data set and provide you with a report that requires no intervention on your side. You don't need to deploy anything to mobile devices, you just need to give us anonymized details of apps. So we've got no user data, we've just got details of the apps in use on the estate, and we can provide a nice report into potential risks. So please, if that's of interest, contact Bytes or contact Lookout directly, and we can help you with that. So that brings me to the end of the session. Hopefully that's been useful. Shona, I don't know if there's any questions that have come in that we want to cover in the last few minutes.
I have one question that's come in, and I would also like to encourage everyone who's listening, if there's anything you've seen that Tom's presented that sparked some questions, or any of the specific clauses in GDPR you think might relate to mobile that we haven't covered, then please do pop those questions into questions and the chat box. On to my first question, while people type away, hopefully, give some more questions. You mentioned mobile device management providers. Can you elaborate on which providers that you integrate with, and to what extent, what information you get from those, how that integration works?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have integrations with, I think, 5 providers at the moment. We have integrations with Mobile Eye and AirWatch, Microsoft Intune, which includes integration with Active Directory, Azure Active Directory. We have MAS 360, and we have BlackBerry Enterprise Server 12.6. So typically the way those integrations work is that we use those as a way of deploying Lookout, because our solution is an agent on the device. So we use the MDM to populate our environment with devices. So you choose which devices you want to deploy Lookout on, and you add those to a group or some other mechanism that imports them into our system. You then also use the tool typically to push our app out. So you can go and get it directly from the App Store, but most organizations like to just control that distribution, and they'll push that out and distribute that directly. And then the third thing we'll do is we'll use that as a way of taking threats coming in and responding to those. So the idea is that if we see a threat on a device, we don't just tell the end user there's a threat, we also tell the admin. And then the third thing we do is we push that real-time update into the MDM so that you can use the capabilities of that MDM to take some kind of action. And examples of that might be notification, it might be to block access to an app, it might be to limit access to data or a network or something like that, or it might be a really severe action like literally enterprise wipe the device and remove it from the corporate environment. So it's very much a sort of two-way integration.
Okay, thanks very much. And I have one further question. How can mobile security technologies be used to assist in the reporting requirements of GDPR, if they can, and how?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, for me, there's 2 elements to this. There's understanding how you're handling and processing data, and also what data you're collecting. And then there's the element of breach notification. So obviously breach notification is an obvious first place to focus. If there's threats that are impacting mobile devices, you'd really like to know about that. And on the one hand, having a container on the mobile device with data in is a measure of safeguard, but some of the threats out there, if they will root or jailbreak the device, or perhaps can capture screen input, screen overlays or keyboard input, they could evade the capabilities of those containers. So it's having that extra layer. So I think visibility of what's happening, and again, there's things like networks people are connecting to, just being able to track that is really important. The other one, which is becoming much more interesting and relevant, I think, is just keeping up with vulnerabilities as well. So you'll see vulnerabilities in Android and iOS, and you'll see vulnerabilities creeping into apps now as people essentially reuse lots of code and tools out there to build their apps. They embed services and SDKs and things like that. So for me, it's about the proactivity of being able to see what state your devices are in, what apps people are using, what versions, are there any vulnerabilities associated with those that we need to react to. So predominantly, I suppose it's a tool to help you focus, it's a tool to keep you safe. But thirdly, it's that documentation of what you're doing. So if someone asks how data is being handled and what safeguards are in place, it's another thing you can point to as part of that process.
Okay, thank you very much. And so I have one more question as well, and keep them coming, audience. So in your experience, where is the biggest area of improvement you've observed where companies are falling short of GDPR on mobile devices?
Reality is, I think most companies are a long way from being where they need to be for GDPR, and I think a lot of them haven't even begun to focus on mobile devices. I think a lot of them are still busy because it's, like you said, Shane, at the beginning, it's a cross-organizational thing, and it sometimes cuts right through to the business of an organization. So it's not an IT problem. If it's being thrown out as an IT problem, that's probably a challenge in itself. So I see things working their way through companies, and mobile is one of the things on the list people are getting to. I think there's a few different things I encounter out there. One is people that don't really embrace mobile at all, and they've sort of ignored it, but in doing that have driven employees to adopt their own shadow IT, and then they don't really know the scale of that because people have sort of, they haven't got the tools in place to monitor that. And it sounds, people think they're controlling it because they've perhaps got perimeter solutions or require people to authenticate to access certain data, but they have very little to triangulate all those different things, like where are they authenticating from, what's the risk on that device they're coming from. It's normally just a credential that they have that they can't really control. So there's that sort of environment. And then at the other end, you've got organizations that have done a lot and put a lot of control in place, but they've limited it to a section of the employee population, normally because they're the most senior people that are deemed to be the greatest risk, or there's cost reasons, or perhaps they started on a rollout and it just didn't work because they were trying to be too restrictive. So I think that the two things I see people trying to work back from is the situation where they've done absolutely nothing and now they're panicking, or the situation where they've done a certain set of actions, but it's only worked for a subset of the population in the organization, and they're now looking at how they can widen that out to some of the other teams out there.
Thank you. That's really useful. So I haven't got any further questions. I will give it sort of 30 seconds for anyone to pop another question across. But what I'd like to do in the interim is to thank Tom for his time to present today. It's been really insightful. And thank you all for attending. I do appreciate you all have very, very busy diaries, and just taking the time to look at this is appreciated, and we hope that you find it useful and that we are hitting the mark in terms of the content for the webinar. Once again, the session has been recorded, it's recording as I speak, and we will share both the slide deck that Tom has presented today in soft copy and the webinar recording as well, across the post session, so you can share that with your teams. Thank you very much, everyone, for their time, and good morning.
Thanks, Shona. Thank you.